Today, we're joined by Leah Sutton, the Chief Portfolio Talent Officer at Balderton, the European multi-stage venture capital fund who have backed companies like Clio, Darktrace, and Revolut. Prior to her role at Balderton, Leah spent more than 7 years at Elastic as their Senior Vice President of Global HR and brings more than 20 years of experience across HR and recruiting. Thanks very much for joining us, Leah.
It's a pleasure to be here.
To jump in, I'd love to hear about your most memorable hire that you've been involved in.
I would love to talk about my most memorable hire. I was thinking a lot about this when I was looking at the questions, and I was thinking about, while I was at Elastic, I think probably as a company, while I was there, we hired several thousand people. My team, and like one of that, 1,500 of those happened in 1 year. So did a lot of hiring. But when I was thinking about my team specifically and the hiring that I was involved in, my favorite hire, probably have two. And when I think about favorites, it really that changed the game for me as a leader. I think one was my first business partner. Actually, three. One was my first kind of HR team person. How do you, make hires that sort of accelerate your sort of success is something I was always looking for. And I think the first one, I just consider this woman, Michelle, she did everything. And so when you're in a startup and growing really fast, and we were a startup, but we had 250 people in 13 countries. And I was really the only HR person to start. I had a small TA team. And this was this first hire. And she came in and I could deploy her kind of anywhere I needed help, which was really everywhere at that point. And so that, I always joke about, like, she was the hire that saved my life in that moment. And then I think as time went on, thinking about hires that are, when you're growing that fast and scaling a company really quickly, people that are really versatile and can continue to shift gears up. And that was something that she did. She's still at Elastic. And the next one that was sort of like that was like, I needed to hire someone to run all of Europe. That was sort of the next gear shifter. And that was a woman called Marina. And then my first business partner was a woman called Gina. And that was great because I always struggled with the engineering leader just in terms of I was spread really thin. He was really wanting a lot of great HR support that I just couldn't do. And bringing someone in that really worked with the engineering team in a very different way and let me focus on, other things was amazing. And then finally, the person that ended up running everything for my kind of operational side of the business, that completely, without that role, I couldn't have lasted as long as I did.
What an amazing journey. So when you joined Elastic, how big was the company?
I think we just done our Series C, so about 250 people.
And so over the next couple of years, kind of where did it get to by the time that you left?
It was 3,200 people in 40 countries when I left.
Wow, what a journey. That's unbelievable. And those examples are really great. I guess, what are the key similarities between those individuals, would you say? What is it that sets those apart in your mind?
When I think about kind of what sets a hire apart in my mind, kind of that good versus great, it's really, I think it changes at the stage of the company you're at. And I think really when you're early, looking for those utility players that can really be deployed kind of wherever, that don't mind wearing multiple hats, but that really have that I'll figure it out mentality, so can get it done in any situation. And that's not just, from an HR perspective, but really when we thought about, hey, we need a great person to lead our, this market for sales or that team for engineering, like who are people that are going to be able to run without a lot of hand-holding, a lot of support. And so that's really that difference of when you're early, you have to, I always think sort of you're a mile wide and an inch deep. And then as you get later stage, you're sort of shrinking kind of the what their purview is, but it's got to be a lot deeper. Being able to switch gears into those different aspects, I think, is really critical. And someone who can do that and has that versatility is going to be more effective.
Nice. How do you ascertain that in a process? So when you meet a candidate for, the first few times you meet them or in the interview process, how do you get a gauge on, how versatile they're going to be, whether they can switch between, as you say, the breadth and the depth?
That's a great question. I think when you think about versatility and how do you sort of pull that out of an interview process, there's a couple of things. I'm a big believer in kind of a structured behavioral interview, right? So not just kind of going in willy-nilly, but making sure that you've got a process and you've really thought through what's the problem I'm trying to solve for with this hire, and how do I get the information I need to make sure that I can do that effectively. And as you know, hiring is, there's a bit of art and a bit of science. And I think there's especially in those kind of high growth moments, thinking about someone who, how do you ask questions that sort of get to their resilience, their grit? Simple things like, I mean, so I was like, tell me about a time, right? But really understanding, you know, how do you react to failure? How do you react to not, if there's a big gray slate in front of you and you don't know where you need to go, how do you approach an open question? So really kind of getting to the heart of that resilience and sort of comfort with ambiguity, I think is really important. And then again, as you sort of get further along, it's like more technical expertise versus like, I need this athlete that can really play across. And then I'm a big believer in making sure that you're talking to people that they've worked with before and understanding, like, smart referencing, right? But really understanding kind of what are those examples of them doing things in ambiguous environments, or can they really show that they've had success where the path wasn't necessarily super clear?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's really interesting because sometimes, you can talk to somebody who happens to have been in the right place at the right time. But
Absolutely.
I really like to dig into the examples and find out, okay, well, what was different because you were there?
Yeah.
What did you
That's
move
right.
apart? They say there are 30 seats on the bus, but there's only one driver, and so I'm
That's
trying
right.
to work out, were you a passenger or a driver in that situation? So, no, that's fantastic.
No, I like that. I like that example of passenger versus driver. I think that's a really accurate one.
When you think back to the roles that, you and your teams have kind of tackled over the years, what stands out to you as one of the more challenging ones that you've had to work on?
I always think of, like, there were two buckets. Product roles where I was really hard. So really understanding kind of, and product looks very different, I think, company to company. I think it also looks very different, country to country. So how I see product in Europe looks very different to how I see product, let's say, West Coast. So really understanding, does how this person approach product or think about product match with how we think about it and how we deliver it, and sort of like, what's that interaction with engineering? And I think those roles where I was particularly hard, partly because we had a complex, sort of multi-product, sort of that's where we're moving as a company. But there are just fewer of those people that can really, I think, effectively partner with the business and with engineering and sort of serve as that bridge. And I think those roles where I was super hard. And I think we also always had a real challenge with go-to-market roles in certain markets. I mean, Germany was also super challenging. I think that, I think that's something I've heard from colleagues here as well. But I think there's certain markets that we just found it really tough, especially as a scaling company. I think open source has its own particular set of challenges, but thinking about how do you find people that are willing to take a bet before you have a super established brand from a go-to-market perspective. It's different on the technical side when it's a well-known technical product, but I think bridging those gaps, those are two areas that were often quite challenging.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Product is always difficult because it's a way of thinking, and it's also,
That's right.
you have to gel with also the, the CEO or the product leaders within the organization. And
That's right.
I remember hiring product managers for Improbable way back when, and we wanted to speak to kind of Google style PMs who are used to working with huge amounts of data and being very, very
Totally.
on the science end of the product and science spectrum of product, and yet actually having an environment where we didn't really have that much data and where it was much more kind of like about taste and feel. And it's such a nuanced role, and it really shows the limits in what you can get with a CV, and really have to speak to those people.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think there's that's the challenge, like, how do you discern from what's on paper versus, and I think that's always, that's the perpetual challenge, I think, in recruitment, is like really interpreting that information. And so how do you get past?
When you've seen hires not work out in a company, what has been the kind of similar patterns or the comparables that you've observed over your experience?
In terms of thinking about what works out, or, when do you think it's going to work well? But I think equally importantly, when a hire doesn't work out, what were the sort of similarities and how does that look? That's definitely something I spent a lot of time thinking about and working with my team a lot. And as we all know, it's very costly when you have a mishire. It's going to happen. No one has a perfect track record. No one bats 1,000. Hiring managers like to think they do, but that's just statistics are going to tell you that's, not really that probable. But I think honestly, there's a few things I have the benefit of looking over thousands of hires and sort of understanding kind of what worked and what didn't. And we spent a lot of time really trying to understand that if something didn't work out, going back to that interview process, looking at the notes, trying to understand from scorecards, like, was there something there? And I think very, very commonly, there was always a little red flag in the process. There was always something where it's like, well, I'm not totally sure, but the hiring manager's in a hurry to hire. They're feeling really stretched. They're like, I got to make this hire right now. And so they didn't listen to sort of what the information had told them, and they went ahead with it anyway. And 9 times out of 10, that wasn't going to work. It might work in the short term, but there was just going to be a mismatch in the long term. And so I think being really aware of like, hey, and having your TA team really say, listen, this is something you raise. Let's talk about that, and making sure that doesn't get lost in kind of the urgency to hire. Because I think that's probably the biggest mistake people can make. It's like, we're waiting. It takes so long to make a great hire, and my team is feeling stressed. I'm feeling stressed. We're just going to move. That's just going to be more costly and take more time in the end. So I think that going back into the data and really understand, like, if there's something that was pretty, and it doesn't even need to be a big thing, but something that just came out of like, it's not quite right, but it's good enough, it's not. And I always say, if people are like, if you're a maybe or a no. So if you look back and someone's like, well, maybe, I'm like, no, there's a yes or a no. Like, maybe isn't actually a valid sort of like answer.
No fence sitting in your teams. It's
no fence sitting.
It's absolutely true. I think back to, the hires I've made where, things didn't work out, and there were always kind of the seeds were there, and it's a lot of the time is that, we work with hiring managers, and hiring managers often by their very nature want to see the opportunity and the best in people. They see opportunities where they think, well, I can smooth that thing out, or I'll be able to coach them, I'll be able to help them. And it's such a difficult thing to do. And I think that you got to remember that in a hiring process, like, that's people generally on their best behavior. And so when
100.
those kind of small flags come out, you kind of think you have to really take it seriously. And I think one of the challenges is, like, as you say, it's time, it's difficult to hire, you're always under pressure. And I think that those are when the mistakes happen. It's when, you've been looking for this role for ages and we don't really have many more candidates, and maybe if we could just overlook this one little thing, and I think
it'll be fine.
It'll be fine. And every time I've done it, it's like, blown up in my face.
Completely. And it's like dating, right? You're like, oh, but now I can fix it. I can fix that person. I can fix that thing. It's like, so it's sort of akin to that. Like, well, if you saw that and you were on a date, would you want to go on a second date? The answer is probably not, right? And so why is it different when you're going to be spending a lot of time with this person? They're going to have a massive impact.
Yeah, this is the thing. I always think it's the behaviors, skill gets you the job, and ability kind of keeps you there. But like, the behaviors are what really, I think, drive success. And I
completely
think
agree.
When I think about all the top performers that I've ever worked with and had the privilege to work with, is they just make the work better by the way that they do it.
It's the how.
And it isn't, yeah, exactly.
It's the how every time. It's the how. And I think when you overlook the how, and I think that going back to like what do people overlook? They're like, oh, there's something about, and I do really hate their like culture fit. Or there's something about like, is this person, is the how, like how they've operated or how they come up with like that. It matters. It really does matter.
Yeah, awesome. When you think about advising candidates, what advice would you give a candidate that's applying for a role, potentially at one of the Balderton companies or just in general?
I always tell people to do your homework, right? To make sure you really think about what kind of company you want to be at. And so I think that, listen, when I think about like, what advice do I give people consistently? It is the like thinking about what are the elements that are going to make you really happy in your day to day. Like, this is where you're going to spend the majority of your time. So what's most important to you? And then equally, what are your no's? Like, what are things that you don't, and even when I talk to candidates now, I always think about like, hey, what's going to really get you fired up, get you really excited, get you out of bed in the morning? Because that's what this is going to do. And then what are the things that are sort of the absolute nots for you? And I think if you are really clear about that going into a process, and as you're starting to look for jobs, that really helps. And I always tell people, like, write it down, because there's something about the act of actually articulating that and putting it on paper that when you get to that moment where you're like, oh, it doesn't necessarily feel right, and you can look back and be like, yeah, it's in this, sort of the below the line things, like these are my no's, and it sits there. It's much easier to say, hey, I don't know if this is the right thing for me. But when you're like, well, could be okay, right? Just like a hiring, sort of, it goes both ways. I think just being really clear with yourself about what you're looking for, and not just the what, but the why. So why is that important, and what difference is that going to make in my day to day? Because at the end of the day, this is where you're going to be spending most of your time. So making sure that you really thought through how do you want to spend your time?
Yeah, 100%. I often say to candidates, it's like, this is the biggest purchase you'll make because it's your time.
100%.
You know,
That's right.
you're
That's
gonna
right.
spend a third of your life at work. You need to really consider it. And I think it worries me because so many candidates I speak to, they kind of fall through their careers. You know, I got into this job because it's the first job I got out of uni, and then I became a senior one, and now I've been doing it for 10 years. And you're like, okay, but this is your life, right?
That's
Like,
right.
are you doing the thing that you want to do? Are you being purposeful?
Yeah.
And it's, I think it's super important. And I'm always really happy when I speak to a candidate and they know what their plan is. They know why they're doing
Right.
things. They understand what they're doing, and they're being far more intentional. And so that's always, I think, a great piece of advice.
I agree. And it's interesting because there's a moment of, I mean, when you're first starting out in your career, like you don't have to have it all figured out because you're going to learn those things over time. But like you said, when you're 10 years in and you're like, oh, I guess it's fine. I guess it's like, there's more you can, just more satisfaction that you're going to get out of that. And if you start to look at the things in life that are sort of driving longevity and happiness and, how you spend your time is really important. And critically, like who you're spending your time with. So I think that piece of it should be met with intention.
100%. You've obviously overseen lots of offers and lots of hired candidates over the years, but for candidates receiving an offer, what advice would you give them? How to approach that situation?
There's a piece of advice I give every candidate, which is always negotiate. So really, really think about, I mean, don't be a jerk about it, but it is the worst thing they can tell you is no. So if you've gotten to the point of offer and they've made you an offer and it's sitting in your hand or in your inbox, they're not going to take it back if you ask for something that's really important to you. And again, all things within reason, but if time is more important, ask for more time, ask for more holiday, ask for if money is really critical and that like you feel like you're worth more, like do your homework. But don't be afraid to ask for what's important to you. I mean, there's obviously limits to that, but again, they'll tell you what that limit is. But if you don't ask, you don't get. And so I think it's really important. And again, there is a gender bias here. I always really coach women on that. I think it's critically, critically important. And recently I've done that with a couple of friends who have come back and said, thank you for pushing me on that. Thank you for telling me that because I asked for that. And they're like, actually, it's like they wouldn't even hire. So I think there's a piece that it feels really uncomfortable, but don't like you are, it is a discussion. It's not just here's the thing. And that's.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I remember I started a job many years ago. I started a job with a friend on the same day. We both started we got a very similar offer, and I negotiated mine and the other person didn't. And 2 years later, the fact that they didn't negotiate their offer was still reflected in the difference between our pay.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I always say to candidates, like, you've got an opportunity, do it the right way, be data driven, be respectful. But as you say, the worst they can say is no. I've never seen an offer pulled because someone politely negotiated.
No, and thousands of offers. I have never seen an offer pulled because of that. Now, I've seen a hiring manager get a little testy about it and saying, hey, and it's interesting, particularly on the go-to-market side. I'm like, this is a salesperson. You want them to be able to negotiate. Like, why are you getting pissed off about this? Like, that is what you expect them to do. And so it's an interesting, but I think it's a really important thing for people to remember.
I think I might pull an offer if a salesperson doesn't negotiate.
Right. Totally.
Love it. Last two questions from me. What do you wish hiring managers knew about recruitment?
The one thing I wish every hiring manager really could wrap their head around, and many are good about it, is like, you own it. Recruiting is your number one job, right? As a hiring manager, it's not your recruiter's responsibility. It is not you own recruiting. And I think when you have a hiring manager that understands that and that the recruiting team is their partner in it, it changes the whole dynamic and I think leads to more successful outcomes ultimately because they have the right accountability for what they're doing.
And what do you wish candidates knew about recruitment?
The thing I wish candidates realized about recruiting is going back to the dating, sort of the dating metaphor, like it is, you are dating, right? This is it's a conversation. It's not a one way, like they're asking you questions and you're not, like if you don't go in again, thinking about that intentionality, like, what do I want to get out of this? Why is this the role? Yes, of course you're selling, but also they're buying. And so I think there's a bit of making sure that you feel like, and you're buying, like it's a two-way street. So I always want candidates to think about like, what do I need to know that's sort of below the surface? Like, what are the things that, and it's okay to ask questions like, hey, what's something you don't like about this company? Like, what's one thing you wish you could change, right? The understanding kind of what you're getting into, because per what you said earlier, you're going to spend a third of your life at work. So you better be damn sure that this is like the right fit for you. And that fit goes both ways. It's not just about the company making sure you fit. It's about making sure you fit with the company. So really encouraging people to have smart questions and really do their homework.
That's awesome. I think that's really well put. It's a buy and a sell. And I think
That's
there's
right.
only a few markets, there are only a few instances where that's true. I think investing is one of those, and I think getting a job is one of those. And I think if you forget that in the process, you can either, not position yourself as well as you could, but you also haven't done your own diligence to.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
Well, Leah, this has been a tour de force. Thank you so much for your time. We very much look forward to having you back in the not too distant future.
It's a pleasure. And I am looking forward to the next conversation.